hello. My name is still Gabrielle. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Greenr. Really nice to have you here today for London Climate Action Week. To give you a bit of context as to what Greenr does, we are a startup based in London, and we are a sustainability as a service platform. So we help companies of all sizes with their sustainability problems. So either it's employee engagement, and we have an employee app that employees can use to compete against one another to have the lowest footprint possible, so similar to a Strava or a MyFitnessPal. And then we also have a carbon accountancy plugin that startups and SMEs can use to actually get a quick carbon calculation in order to get grant funding or to get more investment from investors. So that's what we do. And today we are joined by a really amazing panel, I must say. We're joined by Nicole, Caroline, Jen, and Melissa, which I will introduce very shortly. So thank you very much. All right, so Nicole is dialing in remotely from the US, not from space. And she is an ex-NASA astronaut, having completed 2 space flights and spent over 100 days in space. And prior to becoming an astronaut, she was a NASA engineer for over 20 years. She has since published an amazing book called Back to Earth: What Life in Space Taught Me About Our Home Planet and Our Mission to Protect It, which combines her spaceflight experiences and artistic expressions to foster a sense of responsibility towards our planet. And additionally, she is a co-founder, thanks Caroline, right. Really pushing your book here, Nicole. Additionally, she is also a co-founder of the Space for Art Foundation, which brings together children worldwide through the wonders of space exploration and art. So big round of applause for Nicole. We're so lucky to have her. Next, we're joined by Jennifer Jenkins. Great. So Jen is a true expert in carbon markets and carbon sequestration within trees, having spent her academic and corporate career researching it. She is now leading the way in driving change, ESG strategy, and carbon offsetting as the Chief Scientific Officer at Rubicon Carbon. Prior to joining Rubicon, she worked at Enviva, also the United States Environmental Protection Agency and the USDA Forest Service, where she developed and published the Jenkins equation. It's really cool when you have your name on an equation. And that equation is still used to estimate carbon storage within forests. And last but not least, Jennifer was also the co-recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize in 2007, along with Al Gore and other members of the IPCC. Big welcome to Jen. Wow. Joining me on my left is Caroline. So Caroline Gray is our very own Greenr strategic advisor and board member, but she is also a serial successful entrepreneur, which is a key fact, having built and sold many businesses herself. From patenting a face cream and selling it to Liz Earle to investing in early stage startups such as Databricks and Revolut, Caroline is a true go-to-market guru. She has recently made her mark at Ui Path, being instrumental in increasing their annual revenue from $200K when she joined to over $1 billion when she left. She was also instrumental in their recent $36 billion IPO in 2020. Caroline has now turned fully to the green side, which I'd like to think I had a little something to do, by co-founding treefera. And treefera aims to collect and record trillions of tree data powered by AI, LiDAR, and satellite imagery. Welcome, Caroline.
Thank you very much.
And then last but not least, we have Melissa Barrett. Melissa is an expert in sustainability transformation and regenerative business change. Currently, she is the global head of sustainability services and corporate impact at DSS Plus. DSS Plus is the leading provider of operations management consulting services within the purpose of saving lives and creating a sustainable future. Melissa brings over 20 years of professional experience in the sustainability, consulting, and environmental impact sectors, having previously worked on accounts such as Accenture. And she has also taught at the University of Cambridge and was a scientist for the British Antarctic Survey. We're very pleased to have her as a Greenr strategic advisor and so happy to have her on this panel. Welcome, Melissa. Fantastic. So the way we're going to do this is I have 4 main topics which relate roughly to our panelists' subject matter, but everyone is obviously welcome to contribute at any point. And I'll announce the topics and then announce questions directed probably to the main expert first, and then everyone can just join in with their thoughts. So my first topic is for Nicole. So I must say, I absolutely loved your book, Back to Earth, and especially enjoyed your emotional recounting of your earthrise moment. So I was just wondering, just to kick things off, I'm sure everyone's willing to, learn about your journey and how you went from who you are to being, a space woman.
First of all, I just want to say how thankful I am, really grateful to be here today as part of this panel with all of you incredible women. I am humbled by the awesomeness that all of you are bringing to the world for the benefit of us all. And I'm guessing that along the way, even perhaps without traveling off the planet, all of you have experienced earthrise moments. I think it's just, if we open our hearts and minds to it, it happens. And where I first really acknowledged this idea of an earthrise moment was from space. But like I said, I feel like I have them all the time now here on Earth. And that is just by, I think, opening up my heart and my mind to appreciating the awe and wonder that surrounds me every day. And from space, though, that view out the window of our home planet is life-changing. I mean, really, the reality check in your face of how overwhelmingly beautiful it is, and that it instantly presents you with this sense of interconnectivity of everything. To me, it's pretty incredible to think about how, in all the complexity of what we do, just to lift ourselves out of this hold that gravity has on us here on the planet. I mean, it really holds tight to us. Takes a lot of energy to get off the Earth, to just living and working in space safely for any period of time, and then to come home safely. That's pretty complex stuff to do. But in hindsight, I think the impact really comes down to simple things. And for me, it was three simple lessons from the whole experience that I was presented with. And we all know them when we're like kids. And I argue now that these are the kinds of things we just need to kind of bring actively into our daily lives to help influence the decisions we make, our choices, the way we behave with our family and friends, and all of the life we share the planet with. And that's that we live on a planet. We're all earthlings. And absolutely the only border that matters is that thin blue line of atmosphere that blankets and protects us all. I mean, it is the barrier between life and death for us. It is the only border that matters. And I think really sums it all up, with those three simple lessons, plus this experience of, living on a spaceship with people from all over the world, is that by behaving like crewmates and not passengers, I really feel like we have the power to create a future for all life on Earth that's as beautiful as it looks from space. And that, I think, is the call to action from any Earthrise moment. It's how do we become crew? How do we actively participate in improving, conserving, protecting the life-supporting goodness of our planet for all of us? Okay, that's all.
No, that's great. Thank you so much. I mean, you've gone through all of my favorite quotes, but yeah, definitely some that I picked out from your book that you said is, the most important lesson that you learned as a NASA astronaut was not about space, but about people, and that indeed we're all crewmates of spaceship Earth, responsible for our mutual survival on our one shared home, which I think really does speak to the fact that, if you stop caring about your revenue and borders and wars and things like that, you put it so eloquently, saying the only line that matters is that one blue line that none of us have seen, but you've seen from space, that protects us from the deadly vacuum of space, which is so true. And we need to protect this spaceship Earth, which is really great.
You know what, I like to throw in there, I mean, we talk about having not seen it, but I think we do. I mean, there's no denying the imagery that is, sent very thankfully back to us here on Earth. And I think you can look at it the other way, right? You can stand with your feet firmly on the planet and look up. And while, we look at this blue sky, I'm looking out the window, right now here in Florida at the gorgeousness of it. I find myself thinking about the reality of it, how in our minds, it seems to go on forever, just doing its job. It's just there doing it. And it's like, it feels like this thing that goes on forever. When we know, just the facts of it tell us that it's this veil thin blue line. And I think that, opening ourselves up to that, acknowledging that reality is part of us really figuring out who and where we are in space together and how we can behave like crewmates.
And then my second question for you, I suppose, was when we've spoken before, you said how supportive you are of space travel, which makes sense, and how you feel like so much that we learn on a spaceship can actually teach us about life on Earth. And I'd like to hear a little bit about your experience in the ISS, and what do you take from your time in a spaceship, or you spent a long time underwater as well preparing, right, for space travel. So like, what behaviors did you take from these experiences that you still do every day that hopefully helps all of us have a better planet?
I think it's interesting because I think when we explore, when we do these kinds of things, when we go off purposefully, right? And that's absolutely what's happening when we go off as 5 international space agencies representing 15 different countries, lifting ourselves off the planet into orbit, orbiting the Earth every 90 minutes, with this higher mission of, I honestly believe, like greater good for all life on Earth. And it's kind of cool how every aspect of our lives, has been improved in some way by what we're doing in space. Clean water systems, battling disease, how we communicate and get from point A to point B, translating that technology we use, to measure. This one was so cool to me, like translating the technology we use to measure the temperature between planets into that handheld IR thermometer that all of us experienced as we were coming out of COVID and getting, having our temperature measured. That came from measuring the temperature between planets. And of course, not forgetting how, aside from the people in space working together somehow peacefully, successfully up there as an international community, with this greater mission, not forgetting that we are every day, 24 hours a day, measuring the vital signs of our planet from space. Every day organizations like NASA are understanding the significance of not acknowledging this connection between personal and planetary health. And I think it was mentioned that even in Caroline's work, it benefiting from the use of satellite data to better understand what's going on here. And everything that's gone into the way we build our spacecraft, the science we do in space, the international relationships we've established as a result and maintained, is ultimately about improving life on Earth. And because of this, we even on the space station have the motto, off the Earth for the Earth, because that really defines our mission, this idea of being together for our planet. And one of the things that was really interesting to me, to kind of contrast between how we live and work on a space station to how we live in, or should be, I think, living and working on a planet, is that, somehow we've figured out how to build these mechanical life support systems in space, right? Like the ISS, to mimic as best we can what Earth does for us naturally. And when we're there as this international crew, every morning we wake up, and one of the very first things we do, after going to the bathroom and all those human things that you do, wherever you are, is we check. We check how much CO2 is in our atmosphere, how much clean drinking water do we have, the integrity of our thin metal hull, and absolutely the health and well-being of all of our crewmates. Because if we don't do that, we won't survive there. It's the very basics of what we have to do to survive there. And then we can go on with our day thriving in that place. That is absolutely the best example of living off the grid that you can find. I think it's so cool to look at the space station that way. But ultimately, I think it's just really this wonderful model for how we should be living like crewmates here on Spaceship Earth. And all of the floating and science and everything that we do there, that to me is what it really ultimately comes down to, is this benefit for Earth and how we can bring back that behavior to the way we live and work on a planet together.
You were a NASA engineer for so many years, and you didn't always start in space. And so I guess my question and my topic now is more towards the importance of research in the fight to climate change. And I'll turn slightly towards Jen, but we can all contribute towards that. But yeah, obviously, Jen, you've done your fair share of academic research and PhD, and obviously the Nobel Peace Prize and all of that. So what do you think, in your opinion, and that whole thing. And so what do you think, in your opinion, what is the importance of research in fighting climate change, and how, should we put more importance towards it?
Thank you for coming. Thank you for joining. Thank you for the invitation to be here, Gabby, and it's a pleasure to be here amongst all of you. Thank you for that question. And Nicole, thank you for your inspirational words. I've met you once before, and I'm always just so inspired and impressed with, wow, the sort of way you connect those dots. And as I was thinking about that today, I was sort of thinking, wow, okay, so there's a humility, right? There has to be a humility in science, because we don't know the answer, right? And you're out to you're curious. You have a question. You want to know the answer to that question. That's why you do a study, right? And often, for me, the research has always been about, there's a problem that needs solving, and so what is the sort of least, what's the study, what's the research question that I can design and implement a study to answer, so that we can then sort of move incrementally toward whatever solution we need for whatever problem it is, right? So that may be a little too meta, but it's an interesting process, right? And so the IPCC, which is the group that I was involved in, is sort of doing that, but at a global scale, right? So it's this coalition of scientists from all of the countries that are parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and they have to come together and decide together, which is amazing, what is the body of research, what is the body of knowledge that we can agree on about climate change, right? And so I think in that way, they really have sort of provided a roadmap, right? And here are the problems that we've been able to solve, and here's the catalog of ways we've solved them, and then here are the things that are still yet to be unsolved, right?
Melissa, Caroline, I know you did your PhD as well in underwater carbon sequestration, which I didn't know, which is great. So yeah, what can you say? And obviously you worked with the Antarctic Survey and penguins and all this kind of stuff. So yeah, what can you tell us about that?
So I guess the richness in having, and for me, moving from a science-based background and education and moving into research and development early on and things like that, has given the foundations, I guess, to thinking not just about research itself, but in the reliance on evidence-based, the reliance on good data, the reliance on people making the choices on which topics to study as well. So I think that my career in moving from being a scientist, if you like, and then moving into consulting, I find that it comes back down to exactly what Nicole mentioned over my 20 years probably of career, being a data-focused person, a science-focused person. And then in consulting, I'm now at the point where I'm thinking it's a people-based solution, it's a people-based problem. And so that's my trajectory where I've come through as well, because you end up feeling, right, who's making the decisions on the data? Who's communicating the science? How are people receiving that type of information? What are they doing with that information to be able to inform the choices in their business decisions or their personal decisions as well? So for me, it's been an interesting journey around how to think about the connection of science, evidence-based, and technology, and how that evolves into being a real human issue and topic.
Yeah, absolutely. Nice. Thank you for that. And then my second topic for you, Jen, is regarding obviously the Jenkins equation, and not to go into too many details, but obviously you built it to calculate the carbon sequestration of trees, and I'm going to segue straight into carbon offsets with that. So, what do you think the role of carbon offsets have in the race to zero? And, to say the elephant in the room, carbon offsets have a mixed bag reputation. People maybe don't understand the extent of them, but to loop back to the IPCC report that we were talking about, obviously the rallying call this year was invest in our planet, right? So how do offsets kind of bring or make the bridge between that race to zero, invest in our planet? What are your thoughts?
Yeah. So I think, in keeping with the theme of science and inquiry, right? I mean, I think it is true. Okay, there we go. I hear myself. It is true. I think that the offset market has improved. We're on a journey, right? We're on a journey of continuous improvement. When the first offsets were developed, we didn't even have Google Earth. Okay, so now what we're doing is we're using, what we're doing today is we're sort of using 21st century technology to evaluate a 20th century process. And yes, some of them are coming up short, right? We should expect that. We shouldn't be surprised by that. But we should continue to invest in improving them, which is what the community of practitioners in this space is continuing to do. So my own view is that we need all the tools in the toolbox. We really can't afford to let any of them sort of fall by the wayside because they're imperfect. And furthermore, many of the sort of processes and individuals that are going to be most vulnerable to a changing climate are those that are probably least capitalized and able to manage that change. So the beauty of offsets and sort of carbon finance is that it can provide a way to get capital to some of those more vulnerable regions. And just one more sort of thing, as we think about sort of the panoply of different kinds of offsets, let's not forget that 15% of global emissions today are from tropical forest loss, right? So if we can stem that, we've made a 15% dent in the issue, right? So let's not forget about the, some of those tropical forest protecting the carbon stocks in nature, in our sort of race to perfect technological removals.
Yeah, nice. Thank you. And Nicole, to come back to you, I'm sorry, I didn't actually ask you or brief you on this question, so feel free to ignore. But, when you were in space, obviously, you have, the best view of Google Earth that we could ever have. Is deforestation, or did you notice anything when you were in space that you thought, oh, that's weird, like something doesn't belong there? What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the thing you notice most is, your brain kind of captures the beauty of things that you're looking at for sure out the window. You develop, kind of evolve in the way you look out the window, for like familiar things. I mean, I always wanted to see Florida from space because that's where I'm from. It's where I am right now. I thought about it as my home, and then I thought it was so cool how very quickly Florida became this special place on a planet that's my home. It's amazing how your brain can transition that way. But absolutely, things that would present themselves beautifully to you from space, even areas where you see this contrast in color or topography or I don't know what you could imagine it to be, looks beautiful to you. And then you kind of float back and you're like, oh my gosh, that is absolutely just acres and acres of trees that are no longer there. I mean, you start realizing, okay, that green versus the brown, what am I looking at? You start considering this kind of contradiction in what your eyes are seeing through the window. And I mean, that's everything from, landform kinds of things where something like deforestation is pretty obvious, to fires, to storms, to watching hurricanes moving, across the ocean on the earth and thinking, oh my gosh, that looks like, it's like you're watching it with the mute button on. It's like, oh, it looks like this white, fluffy, swirly, beautiful thing when in fact, underneath it, it's anything but that, right? And I think as humans, these kinds of things, the brown versus the green, allowing that to register, it's something we can do. And then we have the choice to make, right? You know, when I come back to Earth, what am I going to go do? How am I going to try to communicate the experience in a way that allows people to recognize what's going on here, accept the consequences of what it is, you know, like even psychologically, mentally, and then go on and figure out how they can be part of the solution. And I think that perspective, you know, allowing yourself to pull back a little bit and look at things differently. And I think that's what research and science are all about too, right? They're allowing us to look at something in a more comprehensive and precise way that gives us the information we need to solve the problems.
It's definitely, you know, we've discussed it many times amongst each other and on other panels. A lot of the problem in climate change or fighting climate change is an education problem, right? People, when it's something so big and so life-altering and potentially human extinction-ing, it's definitely, you just would rather not look at it sometimes, and it's definitely a form of climate anxiety, and we've talked about that many times at COP26 as well, that people sometimes would rather ignore it and just be an ostrich. And I think if we can bring more education and bring those images, you know, of like deforested land and do it in a way that's still positive and not just like negative news all the time and say, well, this is happening, but actually this is what we're doing to solve it and this is what you can do to solve it, then we'll go a long way. And that segues me into our next topic-ish, which is deforestation and trees, and also, you know, invest in our planet, invest in green tech. And Caroline here, obviously, you've recently co-founded treefera, which aims at, you know, capturing all that data about trees so that we can have more transparency and say, well, that tree used to be there. I know because I have it. Like, I've got record of it. Now it's gone. So what can you tell us, you know, what are the trends that you've seen in climate tech investment space, you know, wearing your your new green cap on, but then also your investment guru cap on? You know, how does it make sense for us to both do sustainability because it's good to do, but do sustainability because it's now it's like a good investment?
Thanks, Gabby, and thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you all very much for coming along. I feel a little bit like the wild card because I have nowhere near the sort of climate experience that my fellow panelists have, so it's a pleasure.
It's always a wild card with Caroline, so that's the trick.
Definitely a wild card. But from a trend point of view, in sort of the investment space, I would say from a personal point of view, I am both optimistic and remaining on the positive side and hopeful around the investment space. So the optimism comes from, if you look at what's happened, you know, we've had sort of a lot of carnage going on. You know, there's a war in Europe. There's, you know, the capital markets have, you know, tanked, you could argue, and in very difficult market conditions. So lots of change, both economically and politically. But actually, out of every investment and portfolio, the climate investments are the most stable. And even to the point as an individual investor, and this is, you know, this is not me making this number up, this is actual, you know, factual quote from many organisations, that if you wanted to invest in a sustainable climate fund, on average that does 4.8 percentage points better than any traditional investment. So I'm not going to look at anyone directly, but obviously if you are an individual investor or a wealth manager caring for people's funds, then, you know, I would really, you know, I really ask for people to think more seriously about that. The other thing that's very, you know, that I think we should be very optimistic about is obviously the US inflation regulation bill, which, you know, Jamie Dimon, sort of CEO of JP Morgan, actually quoted this as being the biggest thing since the railways. I mean, that's huge. So I think, again, all of these things give me huge optimism, and then question, though, why is this not... It feels quite obvious to me.
That is my next question, actually.
Oh, okay, sorry.
Why isn't it happening?
Well, so I think then you know, if you look at, and it is interesting because I think, you know, and I think we touched on it earlier, and you touched on it in your opening thing, that it's education. If I look at the level of investment from, you know, VCs and private equity, actually it's, it's had a very steady increase. In 2021, it was at its all-time high in the space, which is fantastic and really good news. However, sadly, even though we've got all of this, proving that climate investments are resilient, actually it's now taken quite a dip. That said, though, however, you've got to thank people like TPG, and they don't always get thanks, but TPG, Anne and John Doerr. I'll give a plug. I think there's funds, Concept Ventures, Twin Path AI here in the UK locally that are really, really educating themselves and really seeing the benefit and the gain of this can happen, of what can happen. So one of her, as I say, I'm very, very optimistic, but I think the education and positive education is key. Another, sorry to think, but one other thing, if everyone in the UK converted their pension investments into sustainable fund, there's a double benefit there. There's the benefit of this 4.8%. I do want to add, I'm not a financial advisor. Not qualified.
Caroline told me to do it.
But go and Google it. No. And in addition to that, it's also saving, I think it's 15 tonnes carbon per annum.
It is indeed.
Per investment.
Well done.
Gabby, thank you. I am learning. I think it's
it's great.
no-brainer.
Yeah, definitely. And I guess, we don't want to just talk about women in finance, women in climate tech and all these kind of things, but we are a panel of women scientists and women in business. And so from your point of view and all of your points of views, Nicole, Melissa, everyone, have you seen more women enter the tech space? Because now the tech space is kind of turning its gaze towards climate tech. Have you seen a difference there?
Shall I?
You can start, yeah.
There is a difference, so it's a good question. I'm glad you said, is it right? So it's definitely a difference. And again, if we look at what I'm actually really excited about in the climate space, there's this year, last year, 2022, is 26% of funds were given to, 26% of ventures and startups were female founders and given. So that's, I think it deserves a round of applause. Fantastic. Compared to in the industry of overall investment, not more, it's actually at 6%.
Wow,
so I'm really, really excited. And even doing what we're doing, I can really see, the great, and it's not just women, it is diversity. Because years ago, having come from sort of Ui Path and different companies, we talked, we've been talking about diversity for a long, long time. And I think diversity is about, sometimes it's taking a risk, albeit I think that risk is lower, but it's recognising that we need equality, not just in, the diversity of people, but where people come from and their opportunity. So it is taking a risk in going outside your network and finding those people. But I think the excitement is the fact that in the climate space, we can see so many people, diverse people coming through as scientists, sales leaders, as founders, people with great ideas, people that want to operate. So I think very, very exciting.
Nice. One of my favorite facts, which is a bit random, but is that in 2022, I believe that women CEOs have now taken over CEOs called John. So that's good.
Very good.
Any other comments on women in women scientists, women in tech? Have you seen any trends recently, or you're hiring at the moment, Melissa? Plug.
We are hiring a lot, and I think that there's something as well in whether it's women or whether it's just diversity more broadly that is really strengthening the way we think about systems change. And there's one thing about tech and tech founders. I think there's another thing about how you mobilize that tech as well. And I come back to my point before around actually if you're going to have any tech, if you're going to have any data, if you're going to have any communications around this, then you're addressing an audience that looks like this audience or looks like an audience that is diverse. And so we need to think more and more about how those applications are being received again and how we engage. And so the more we have women within tech, the more that we're going to have that tech designed to be actually something that's accessible, something that is going to be meaningful in organizations and with people who are making the biggest and strategic decisions that we have in our time.
Can I want to add to that if I could. I'm used to, so I'm in forestry, right? A woman in forestry. So not a lot of women in forestry, right? Not many you know, and I'm used to sort of being the only woman in the room, and et cetera, et cetera. But I do have to say, like, I'm encouraged by the growth, I think, in people, women especially, in sort of tech careers. The evidence I have, right? I looked up one day, and my team is maybe, how many do I have? I think I have 5 people on my team. And I looked up, and I was like, wow, you guys are all women. There's one guy on my team, right? And I mean, right? I'm thinking, wait a minute, maybe I need affirmative action for men, because somehow I end up hiring all the women. But these were the people who were obviously the most qualified, and, you know, the best candidates who applied to the job. So I'm encouraged, right, for what it's worth.
I'll just, from the space, well, I have to speak to the human spaceflight side of things. And I don't know what the secret sauce is, but somehow over the years, I think the human spaceflight industry has been one of the most like progressive when it comes to diversity, inclusion, all of these things just in general, and in particular from the standpoint of women having roles, and not just, having very high level roles within the human spaceflight world. And I think back, we have recently had the 50-year anniversaries of all the Apollo stuff. And now we're getting ready to go back to the moon, and go back to the moon with the first woman, the first person of color to be in a place like that, very purposefully, And 50 years ago, when we were launching Apollo missions, there was only one woman in the Mission Control Center in Houston, and she wasn't in the front room, Poppy Northcutt. She was in the back room cranking out numbers somewhere. And then in Florida at the Launch Control Center, there was one woman, Joanne Morgan. She looked like a 12-year-old, beautiful, sitting in the middle of all this sea of men in the Launch Control Center. And now, and 50 years might seem like a long time, but I think it's nothing in the grand scheme of things. In those 50 years, now both of those really important organizations with respect to human spaceflight are run by incredible women. And when you look out, I can't see the audience that you have there, the participants that you have there today, but when you look out at either of those control centers, it's just this mix of humanity, like all the different flavors of people are just in there. And I think it's because it's an attractive problem to be solving. It's an attractive place to work. It's about solving really complex, challenging, meaningful problems. And if I look at the NASA Astronaut office now, which when I came into it was roughly 18 to 20% women, now of the 40 active NASA astronauts, roughly 40% are women. And that is really compelling, because when you look at the pool of people where we choose astronauts from, that's still in the 20 to 25% range. Right. So pretty cool that almost half of the astronaut office is women. Those numbers continue to get better. But I think one of you mentioned, it's like, what is the right number? Are we not happy until it's 50-50? Or, I don't, at some point it's got to not be about the numbers, but about the awareness and the, being welcome, right? Knowing that within whatever industry it is, whatever workplace it is, that you are welcome to be there to bring your talents, and that you're not going to get turned away because you got brown hair or you're a woman. It's got to be this, I think this shift in the way we communicate about the opportunities that are out there.
Yeah, I think it's also about just the bias or the assumption, right? When we say, oh, I'm interviewing an ex-astronaut tonight, that people don't say, oh, I hope he's really good. You know what I mean? Like, it's about just being they, or just saying, well, I don't have any assumption of what gender this person might have, because it could go either way. And so I think it's great that we're reaching that point now where, if you say, oh, the CEO, we're meeting the CEO, you don't automatically assume that it's a man and things like that. So yeah, we've definitely done big strides, which is great. And then my last question for you, Caroline, was kind of regarding more tech side of things. Actually, Melissa, you made a compelling point that, when you have tech, you have a certain responsibility to make it accurate and data-driven. But then we've mentioned before that you also have a responsibility to make it frugal. Who actually talks about the carbon footprint of the tech that's being used to fight the carbon footprint, right? And so, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I appreciate this question, Gabby, because anybody that knows me, I won't sit here and pretend that I'm the most frugal person in the world. but thankfully for education, it's helping me somewhat. And I think, you know, if I look at it now with my founder or co-founder's hat on, I look at it, and the more I've been educated around the things that we're doing at treefera, 3 years ago were not really possible because the technology wasn't able to do it. And then 2 years ago, well, 18 months ago, it would have taken us probably a year to build up what we're able to do in 5 days. So that whole thing, so, you know, and it gets back to the AI, and I'm sorry to talk about AI because it seems to be talked about everywhere at the moment. But from an artificial, I really think that AI can be absolutely for the good with many of these things that we talk about. But by that, the frugality point comes in because the computational cost of that with regard to energy resources and so on, a bit like it was in, you know, the fossil fuel world, these hidden costs that you don't necessarily think about from the outset, I think are becoming really, really critical because we have, within treefera, we are obviously naturally, because the whole purpose of us is to protect trees and promote afforestation and forest management. And therefore, to do that, we would be very hypocritical if we were suddenly in the back end using a huge amount of computational power. So for us as a startup, and it's something we've talked with other founders about, is that I think it's really, really critical to use quite creative ways, and that's what we're doing, is using creative techniques within AI to ensure that we absolutely optimize and manage that use very, very frugally. But for that, we obviously need to be very mindful and, of course, curious to ensure we maintain it.
Yeah, it's a really good point. And I think also, we've spoken about this before, but it's also about expectations and time. You know, sometimes you can make something be a tiny bit slower, but then so much less compute power, and it's about managing people's expectations and saying, well, you might not get it immediately, but then it's going to cost less money and less carbon and less of everything. And that's definitely something that you, or at least NASA, has experience with, right, Nicole? Like managing the amount of power and sheer amount of resource that you have in a space station. You can't just make it up, right? So it's about being frugal with all of that, right?
I think it's, you know, just understanding the extent of it, right? Understanding what exists, whether that's, you know, how much power you got stored in your batteries from those big solar arrays, or the, you know, the clean drinking water, or, you know, your access to getting home, all of these things, the food that's been sent to you. I mean, it's all about considering, you know, those very basic needs, and then leveraging that to be able to do the really incredible, you know, science stuff that's going on and bring, you know, people from all over the world together. But absolutely, it's no different. And part of that, I think, is, you know, going into it very thoughtfully with the idea of, I know I need to maintain this much clean drinking water on the space station, or to be able to produce it there, to be able to survive here. And then if the quantity gets low, how do you deal with that? You know, not just saying, okay, well, it's low today, let's forget about it. It's got to be a very active, proactive interaction with those resources all the time.
I think that's definitely something we just take for granted on especially, you know, in the UK or whatever. You take water for granted and resources for granted, but everything is finite. We live on spaceship Earth, and we can't make more. And so definitely, I think we're seeing, or people are being educated despite themselves, with now way more hosepipe bans and droughts and things like that. Actually, oh, this could be a problem here as well. So unfortunately, we'll see a lot more people passionate about it, but because it's, you know, it's come to them. Interesting. And then our final topic, which is, you know, geared a little bit towards Melissa here. So Melissa, obviously you're a successful sustainability expert, and you've helped many huge, you know, companies with their sustainability strategies, from the likes of Coca-Cola, Unilever, Vodafone, WWF, and, you know, more recent companies that we may or may not be able to talk about now. But yeah, obviously you've helped them set, yeah, it's being filmed, so. So you've helped them with their sustainability strategy, with their goal setting. So a couple questions from us. You know, what do you see companies struggle with the most when it comes to sustainability or ESG interchangeably?
It's a big question.
Yeah, I know, sorry.
Very good. I think that there's a moment in time at the moment that organizations are more informed. They have more employees who are aware. Those employees are not necessarily called activists anymore, they're just called well-informed. which is putting more pressure on the organizations, more pressure from the consumers, more pressure from the suppliers even. One of the biggest problems I think that organizations are having is often less on the what do we do, but how do we do it. And so it's not hard to say we should be net zero, possibly, or your form of a reduction target that ends up being zero, right? That's a bit, or 100% if we're talking trees, right? Whatever it might be, but there's the actual targets themselves are less of the problem, it's how do we get there? So we can talk about the business models that need to change. You can talk about a company that needs to ultimately shift its product portfolio or its sourcing location, or it's got supply security issues. We can talk about those business model changes that need to happen. Secondly, I think that there's also just an organizational shift. So how are we actually going to do it? And that requires people. And so I think often with the organizational shift, we can talk about the big disruptive changes, but I'm finding as well, clients are calling us up, are asking, and this is where I think there's a real opportunity, is actually to help navigate through what does that roadmap look like. Where do I focus first? And focusing first isn't always on the thing that's most obvious. Focusing first isn't always on the big material topic. It might be, but you might get more movement from your organization if you follow somewhere that's going to be something that gets the ball rolling. So I think the biggest questions actually are on the how, and in particular because there's so much happening now around the compliance and regulatory markets that are putting all this confusing pressure on what do we report, what do we have to do. It's really confusing around, okay, what does net zero or net positive, whatever what goal you want. So there's all these pressures that seems really confusing at the moment. But if you step back and look at your own organisation, you can have a good view actually of what you can be doing by thinking about who are you as an organisation. So I often talk about a little bit the ways organisations need to think about changing is actually looking in, not just setting their purpose, but actually looking into what makes them tick.
And also what we're seeing sometimes is, you can ask how, and you can ask, what is the extent of our carbon footprint, and that can feel very overwhelming, especially if you're a large company and all of your business comes from coal. Like how do you even go about that? And you actually have experience with that, which is amazing. But also the question is, when to start, and just starting today. Like don't have it all figured out immediately. Just take one step at a time. And that's the same with space travel, maybe. I guess you kind of have to have it figured out once you're in space, but once you start thinking about a mission, start a little bit today, and it comes with all of you. Like if you're employed by a company, we see that when we go see clients, it's a lot easier once the employees, there's already a sustainability group, and they're like, oh, this person that was the office vegan, we've made head of sustainability, and you're like, what? And then they suddenly have 20 people, but then you have a group, and then you can actually achieve quite a lot. I don't know if you've seen that if you have the people, even if they're, interns, doesn't matter, if they are loud and they say, let's do something about it, management will be happy to start,
Absolutely, and I think as sustainability professionals and the change makers, everyone's always said, oh, you need a good leadership, or you need a common purpose, and we've always talked about this as being what brings us together. Yes, that's important, but actually the change makers happen everywhere else. What we find is a little bit of education can go a long, long way, right? So we do a lot of work around, I guess, bringing the awareness up a little. And what I like to think about is a little bit of education, a little bit of awareness is dangerous. Dangerous is good, right? Because people are asking better questions. They're informing the day-to-day work and their decision-making as they go along. And so it's about activating people from what you might say the shop floor, or from wherever you might be in your organization. What is your sphere of influence on making change? And actually that adds up.
Yeah. So I hope you're all activated. But yeah, no, it's interesting. And we've heard also from companies that hire talent, right? So now a couple of stats that are interesting, you know, like almost 50% of all new businesses that are founded today are founded by people that are millennials or Gen Zs, right? And these traditionally have a more higher education in, you know, climate issues and things like that. And so now, or people that are going to the job market, over 67% of millennials would quit their current jobs and to work for a sustainability company. So now you're a recruiter and you're working for this company, you'll have someone, do you have any further questions? They'll be like, yeah, actually, what's your sustainability mission? And so that's really interesting that we can start making change just by asking someone in an interview, you know, what's your sustainability mission? So that's interesting. And I guess that brings me to, we've segued perfectly into the second question. It's almost like we've practiced. Yeah, what are these? And so the question was, you know, like, have you seen, so you've worked in sustainability and changing those massive companies for 20 years. Now that you're doing it, maybe you're doing slightly different companies now, but have you seen a change in the number of stakeholders that are supporting you when you come in and saying, hey, I'm going to change your entire business model? Would you see now?
It differs. And I think being here in the UK and in particular, there's been more maturity, I guess, around sustainability and ESG than in many other places. Or actually, there's a different narrative to that change. So I think we're finding a lot more people are interested. You find a lot more executives that are taking themselves on sustainability courses. They're interested because they're being asked by their nephew or their niece or their team on these topics, and they're feeling uncomfortable, right? And so they're taking themselves on these on many courses and things like that. So there's an interesting piece where people are more informed, but there are gaps. And in particular at leadership levels, there's really big decisions to be made on climate and on sustainability, on ESG. Those decisions are not decisions that are just affecting the next month or the next quarter performance. Right? These decisions are affecting not just the next year, but we're looking 5 years or 10 years, 2050, right? So the decisions that executives are having to make are those that actually they don't always have the education, they don't have the science background, they don't have the data-driven background, perhaps, to have that. And so I think there's more stakeholders really interested, but actually you have to do some work to think about how comfortable do I feel making decisions on behalf of very large organizations that are going to not affect my performance today, but those are the generations to come. So that's not just education, that's a cultural thing, that's a mindset, that's a behavior, that's something that's quite a personal journey to be on as well.
Mm-hmm. That's amazing. It takes, it's courage and doing the uncomfortable thing, right? It's not about the easy pickings and things like that and the low-hanging fruits anymore. It's about being uncomfortable and seeing the long vision. And when we spoke earlier, you know, you think about a large chemical company, for example. You mentioned before that one of the big hurdles towards, you know, probably providing a green fuel or a green chemical might be the price point, because at some point, you know, money rules. And so you can't do everything to just be sustainable. At some point, you're stuck. And so what external factors do you think needs to happen in order to fix those hurdles, whether that's price point or something else? Is it government? Is it time? Or is it something else?
Gosh, I think we can all have a play with that question as well. I've talked a little bit about people and the human decision-making that needs to happen. As soon as you're talking bigger problems like buying, or you have a customer with which to influence and you're asking them to pay a higher price point, whether that's for a food product or a chemical product, right? You're needing to get real engagement. It no longer is a contractual conversation that you need to have. And so I think these external factors are typically about how do you actually help organizations, companies, to be able to interact together, to not just partner, to think about themselves as a system. We don't live in silos, organizations don't live in silos, they're part of systems, they're part of value chains. And so I think some of the external factors where we can say, yes, regulation is pushing and will continue to push and make things happen, that's cool. But how do we actually affect change through helping organizations to be able to collaborate better, thinking of themselves as a system? And that changes the sort of commercial metrics that they need to think about. It requires organizations to be able to be the broker for those companies. You need to break down the barriers that might have existed, and also you need to look at what is the opportunity for all, as opposed to being siloed in terms of what is my competitive advantage with selling something at a higher price.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, so exactly on your point, what you said, and it brings us back to Nicole, is that even in a capitalistic country, we're still all, members of Spaceship Earth, and we should all work together. And if a technology, like if someone knows how to make a cheap biofuel or a cheap chemical that is green, it would be a shame if that is kept, for themselves. And obviously the reality is, and we're all, being inspired and maybe a bit naive, in reality it doesn't, because people keep it from themselves. But, if we can have more collaboration between people and between companies, then we will accelerate our fight against climate change, which is what we need, right?
Yes, and I think there's a certain amount of time. You mentioned time at the start as well that's required, and I refer back to what you're doing with carbon markets as well. There's time for things to evolve, and you sometimes need to let the economics and the market dynamics work through it as well. But it's great to see that the innovators are out there pushing as well. So you need a bit of both of these innovators to keep pushing, so please keep pushing. To be able to see the opportunities in a more sustainable product or a more sustainable way of doing business. And those pushes will eventually come through. And the market dynamics, I hope, will catch up.
Yeah. And I think it also, if you're a company and you're deciding, should I go down the sustainable path or not, an interesting survey that came out a couple weeks ago, I think they interviewed around 150,000 people and asked them, out of any brand in the world, what is the brand that you trust the most? And it wasn't, like a bank or a water company or anything, it was Patagonia, overwhelmingly. And obviously they have great marketing and they've done great things, but it's great to see a brand that, has put planet before profit actually reaps back rewards of people just trusting them. And so hopefully we can all take a little bit from that. And if you say, okay, if you take the uncomfortable decision now, and maybe you spend a bit more and you do more sustainability, then more people will trust you and you'll get more investment, more customers, and it should be a good thing, ideally.
Yeah, and I think you comment on one thing with Patagonia, that they've built trust. They've built trust over time. Trust takes time to build. You build trust by being authentic and by fulfilling the promises that you've made to your stakeholders, right? So they are fulfilling those promises. For us to be able to trust in other organizations, it does take time, and they need to be fulfilling the promises that they've made over time. So I think it comes back down to a big part of how you think about organizations that are in a moment of transition and change. And I work with some of the what might be called the hardest to move, or some of the companies with the biggest sustainability and climate problems, right? We need to give some breathing space for them to be on the transition as well. So whether it's a transition fuel or whether it's a transition journey, we're going to have to move some of the heavy industry companies, not just the consumer brands, if we're going to be able to make a difference. So give it a little bit of time, and I think support the transition companies as much as we're supporting the iconic sustainable brands.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you very much. I think we'll wrap it there for the questions and open up to Q&A, but thank you very much to all our speakers. Big round of applause.